Operation Elephant is remembered as a German paratrooper last stand, but when Canadian troops finally linked up on the morning of 31st of January, the defenders weren't waiting to surrender or lying annihilated in their positions. They had quietly vanished in the night. The link-up joined two Canadian battalions that had spent 6 days fighting across an exposed river position in winter. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada advancing from one side and the Lincoln and Welland Regiment from the other. One later operational account places their meeting at 0800 near the building Canadians called Raspberry. By then, the organised German garrison had gone. Official Canadian accounts state that German paratroopers evacuated the island on the morning of 31st of January under cover of a massive artillery barrage. Later reconstructions place the decisive movement during the night of 30th to 31st of January. Those versions differ on the hour, but agree on the fact that matters most. By the final Canadian consolidation, the German defence had ended in evacuation. That absence changes the entire story. A modern last stand label suggests a position fought to the last man, an ending marked by surrender, annihilation, or a final assault through the ruins. Operation Elephant had none of those endings. It had hard fighting, repeated counterattacks, frozen men on open dikes, tanks struggling through mud and ice, and 2 buildings taken, lost, and taken again. Then there was silence. To understand why that silence is so unsettling, we need to return to 26th of January 1945, when the German position still looked built for exactly the kind of final stand later retellings promised. Operation Elephant was the 4th major effort to remove a German bridgehead on a low, exposed island near the Maas. Earlier attacks had failed. Polish forces attacked in late December 1944 and again in early January. The 47th Royal Marine Commando, with Norwegian troops attached, attacked on the night of 13th of January. That effort also failed. The final task went to Major General Chris Vokes's 4th Canadian Armoured Division. Its immediate order was blunt: clear all enemy from Kapelsche Veer. That was the documented order in this battle. No surviving source in the available record gives the German garrison an equivalent written instruction to hold at all costs. The phrase fits the later legend, but it isn't a proven German command order. The ground itself made the position look formidable. The island was low, flat, waterlogged, and nearly without natural cover. Dikes ran along its southern side, rising above the surrounding ground. In January, their slopes were frozen, muddy, and exposed to fire. A roadway ran along their tops. Once infantry climbed a dike, it became visible against the snow and sky. At the eastern end, Canadian engineers rebuilt a demolished crossing only 500 metres from German positions. They created an improvised crossing that the engineers named the Mad Whore's Dream. It wasn't a casual nickname for a casual bridge. The route had to carry men, smoke equipment, supplies, and eventually tanks toward the island. Engineers worked at night, moving stores by raft and by hand-pulled trailers along ice-covered roads. They had room for about 15 men to push or pull a load. Mortar fire remained a constant threat. Across that exposed ground stood a German Fallschirmjäger garrison. The popular version often identifies the defenders as the 13th Parachute Regiment. The available records point elsewhere. The strongest identification places the garrison in the 6th Fallschirmjäger Division, with elements of Fallschirmjäger Regiments 10 and 17. The force was company-sized. Canadian accounts and later assessments describe roughly 150 German paratroopers on the island at one point, about 150 men. That is a small number when printed on a page. On a narrow strip of frozen ground built around dikes, houses, slit trenches, and concealed positions, it was enough to stop repeated attacks. The Canadian plan required more than one approach because no single advance could safely dominate the whole position. The Lincoln and Welland Regiment carried the initial infantry burden. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada attacked from the eastern side. Tanks from the South Alberta Regiment provided direct fire where the ground would allow them to move. Engineers built routes, ferries and bridges simply to get men and machines into the fight. The Lincoln and Wellands also assembled a canoe force of 60 volunteers. Their task was to paddle toward the harbour and block German reinforcement by ferry. 4-man canoes would move through smoke along an icy river, while infantry companies advanced over the dikes. The operation began on 26 January under smoke and flame. Sources differ slightly over the opening minute. One account places the smoke barrage at 07:15. Canadian engineer material places the assault at 07:45. What is clear is that the first assault unfolded in darkness, lifting toward a winter morning behind a thick artificial screen intended to hide movements that the terrain otherwise exposed. The smoke was necessary because the attackers had almost nowhere to disappear. The Lincoln and Welland companies moved toward 2 buildings at the heart of the German position. Canadian staff had given them code names easy to remember under pressure: Grapes and Raspberry. Grapes was the caretaker's house. Raspberry was the ferry house near the harbour. They were brick buildings, but they were more than 2 visible points on a map. The German defence used the ground around them as much as the walls themselves. Argyll diary material describes defenders in well-dug-in slits along the dike and in the basements of the 2 demolished houses. Later narratives describe tunnels beneath or around the buildings. That difference in language matters. We can securely picture slit trenches and basements. We can say later accounts describe tunnels. What we can't responsibly picture is an elaborate underground fortress drawn from certainty where the surviving record is less precise. Still, the tactical consequence is clear. Taking the house above ground didn't mean that every defender beneath, beside or behind it had been removed. The canoe attack showed how quickly the landscape could defeat a plan. The men had trained with their canoes before the operation, but the river carried ice. At the start of the attack, the canoe party had to haul boats over ice before getting them afloat. The smoke shifted. The canoes were pushed farther into the stream, where cover thinned and German fire reached them from the banks. Several boats were hit or sunk. The force that began as 60 men was reduced to about 15 by the time survivors reached their landing point. Their snowsuits had become soaked and heavy in the freezing water. Some rifles froze and became useless. German machine guns, firing fixed lines through the smoke, caught the men as they tried to move along the dike. The river route had not opened the German rear. It had become another exposed approach. On the eastern side, Lincoln and Welland troops drove forward through the smoke toward Grapes. One company advanced toward the building before heavy fire stopped it. Flame projector resources couldn't overcome the dike slopes and mud. Men had to advance on foot through snow and fire. By mid-morning, the attack had lost momentum. A German counterattack drove Canadian troops backward. One Lincoln and Welland company lost all of its officers. By the end of the first day, the Canadians had not simply walked through a small German outpost. They were fighting for every usable stretch of dike. Yet the German position wasn't static. A detailed reconstruction of the fighting records a temporary Canadian success later on 26 January. The Lincoln and Wellands took Raspberry with Sherman tank support. By late afternoon, both Grapes and Raspberry were reported in Canadian hands. On a map, that looks decisive. 2 red flags become 2 blue flags. The visible buildings have changed hands. The centre of the defence appears captured. Except German defenders remained in concealed positions. Some were in slit trenches along the dikes. Others were in the basements of the damaged houses. Later accounts describe a large number of tunnels. In practical terms, Canadian troops held the surfaces of Grapes and Raspberry without having erased the defensive system attached to them. After dark, on 26th of January, German paratroopers counterattacked. Before midnight, according to the detailed reconstruction, they had retaken both buildings. This wasn't a final stand. It was a defence that could disappear below the ground, survive the loss of its most visible landmarks, and return after dark. The result was severe for the Canadians, but it also revealed the mechanism of the battle. Grapes and raspberry weren't isolated houses, they were surface markers for a much larger defensive problem. Dikes, covered positions, basements, and concealed fighters who could emerge when daylight control broke down. The next 4 days became a slow effort to close that problem from both directions. The Argylls took a larger role from the eastern axis. The Lincoln and Wellens, battered in the opening fighting, remained engaged from the other side. South Alberta tanks gave the infantry fire support where crossings, mud, and narrow dike roads allowed them to operate. Engineers continued moving equipment through a landscape that resisted every vehicle. One tank could cross a bridge and still find little room to turn. Another could reach the island and then become trapped by the same mud it had crossed to support the infantry. Heavy vehicles and tracked carriers repeatedly bogged down as snow, rain, sleet, and shellfire converted the surface into deep mud. The fight was narrow in geography, but not simple in movement. A tank raft built at the western end of the island faced heavy ice. On the night of 28th of January, engineers struggled to ferry a single tank across the canal. Falling snow prevented the operators from seeing the far side. Ice packed around the raft's pontoons and fouled its propellers. The engines ran at full throttle while men chopped and pushed frozen blocks away from the craft. That crossing changed what could be brought forward. It didn't make the ground easy. By 27 and 28th of January, Canadian attacks and German counterattacks continued across the position. Mortars and machine guns punished any movement along the exposed dikes. The German garrison remained active. It had not vanished early, and it had not merely waited for the final evacuation. This matters because the empty battlefield of 31st of January has sometimes been misread as proof that the Canadians faced no substantial defence. They did. The government account of the battle describes 5 days in which the Argylls, South Alberta tanks, and the remaining Lincoln and Welland troops continued to hold and advance. German counterattacks remained fierce. Frostbite, exhaustion, and constant digging added to the burden. Men had to scrape cover into frozen earth because the island offered almost none. Later Canadian histories described the operation as 5 icy days of nasty fighting and sheer misery. Those words belong to the Canadian troops who had to keep moving toward the same 2 buildings after the first apparent capture had failed. A diary-based reconstruction by historian Terry Kopp places the final recovery of grapes on 29th of January. The Argylls took it after the earlier reversal. Raspberry followed on the evening of 30th of January. That sequence is important because it separates 2 events that later summaries can blur together. On 26th of January, Canadian troops temporarily captured both houses, and German counterattacks took them back. On 29 and 30 of January, the Canadians fought again and regained the objectives. So the battle didn't pivot on one clean attack. It turned into a contest of possession, loss, recovery, and endurance. Grapes and raspberry had become proof that visible control was temporary. By 30th January, the Canadian grip had tightened. The Argylls held grapes, raspberry had fallen in the evening. The Lincoln and Wellens remained on the western side. The 2 Canadian advances were closing the final gap between them. That same day, official Canadian material records 2 German attempts to send reinforcements to the island by ferry. Both ferries were sunk in the river. It's tempting to build a complete explanation from that detail, to say the German command decided the position could no longer be held, or that the garrison had completed a mission, or that the withdrawal had been planned from the start. The record does not prove those claims. We know the Germans had defended the position for days. We know they counterattacked after losing the named houses on 26th of January. We know they attempted to bring reinforcements across by ferry on 30th January. We know the Canadians had retaken Grapes and Raspberry by the final phase of the battle. We don't have a secure German order explaining why the evacuation happened when it did. That uncertainty is part of the story. The final night didn't leave behind a detailed, fully documented German narrative. No accessible Canadian patrol report identifies a particular soldier or platoon as the first to discover the main garrison absent. No reliable record gives us a complete inventory of weapons left behind, traps encountered, or groups moving to particular crossings. Some later accounts describe an organised departure across the Maas in darkness. They suggest small groups moving toward water crossings and leaving obstacles for pursuers. Those details remain uncorroborated in the available operational record. The firm evidence is narrower, but it is enough. German paratroopers evacuated the position in the final night-to-dawn phase of the battle. Official Canadian accounts say a massive German artillery barrage covered the evacuation on the morning of 31st January. Later operational narratives say the garrison had left during the night. The artillery is documented. The exact minute of departure isn't. This was a withdrawal conducted under fire and darkness, not a scene designed for later legend. The men who left didn't leave a heroic tableau for the attacking Canadians to discover. They left an absence. Morning came on 31st January, with the Canadian units still separated by only a few hundred yards. The Argylls moved forward from the eastern side. The Lincoln and Welland Regiment held ground from the other direction. One later operational synopsis gives their link-up time as 0800. That account says the final advance was easy because the Germans had evacuated during the night. Another diary-based reconstruction places the contact near Raspberry and records that no live German defenders remain south of the main Maas channel, apart from prisoners. The larger official record is careful but unmistakable. German paratroopers evacuated the island on the morning of 31st January. For Canadian troops, the link-up was the visible tactical resolution of Operation Elephant. The two battalions had finally connected across the ground that had resisted them since 26 January. The island was secured. The German bridgehead was gone. But the meaning of that achievement changes once we look at what was missing. The final Canadian movement didn't culminate in a mass surrender at Grapes or Raspberry. It didn't uncover a garrison destroyed to the last man in its basements and slit trenches. It didn't confirm a literal hold at all costs order, because no such German order has been established. It confirmed something quieter. The Canadians had fought through a real and stubborn defence. They had crossed frozen water, attacked behind smoke, lost men on exposed dikes, endured counterattacks, and reclaimed the same two buildings after they had been lost in darkness. The final link-up was earned by that fighting. But the German garrison itself had not waited to be overrun in a final scene. The phrase, "all enemy south of the Maas had been liquidated," appears in later summaries of the battle. Taken alone, it sounds like annihilation. The official Canadian record corrects the impression. The German paratroopers evacuated. In military language, the position had been cleared. In human terms, the battlefield was empty. Operation Elephant wasn't an invented last stand. The defence was severe. Roughly 150 Fallschirmjäger had occupied a small, difficult position built around dikes, slit trenches, basements, and the houses called Grapes and Raspberry. They resisted a Canadian divisional attack for 6 winter days. They counterattacked after losing the visible objectives. They held on until the Canadian advances finally converged. But it wasn't a literal last stand. It was a hard-fought defence whose final act was evacuation under artillery cover, late on 30th of January or early on 31st of January 1945. At 0800, in the account that gives the exact time, the Argylls reached the Lincoln and Welland Regiment near Raspberry. The two Canadian battalions met, and the German garrison had already gone.